With the injuries and the inconsistencies the Orioles struggled through in their bullpen late this season, they had to make some late year additions to that pen. Guys like Matt Bowman, Colin Selby, and Burch Smith. But the question is, could any of those guys stick around and make an impact in the O's pen in 2025? We'll try to answer that question by reviewing all of their seasons with the O's coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Thursday, October 31st, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we are going to review the 2024 season for three of the Orioles relievers who all came over in the second part of the season and all had varying degrees of impact on this O's bullpen. That is Matt Bowman, Colin Selby, and Burch Smith. We will continue our Orioles player season review series with those three relievers, talk about what went right and what went wrong for each of those guys, and then talk about their biggest storylines going into the offseason, which will be kind of similar for each one. Can they figure out a way to get a spot in the O's bullpen in 2025? But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. So again, we're going to talk about these three relievers who really, it's hard to get through an entire Major League Baseball season without shuffling through a good chunk of your bullpen throughout the year. And some teams have a lot of depth at AAA. They'll kind of shuttle through. But the Orioles were in more of an interesting spot. Some of it was because a lot of the relievers in their bullpen this year were out of options. They had a lot of guys who had to be DFA'd if they wanted to move on from them. It was one of the reasons why they held on to Matt Bowman for so long and then just finally cut bait there. And there's some other guys they held on to longer too. And it also meant that some of the guys they were bringing in to fill, the 6th, 7th, and 8th spots of an 8-reliever bullpen were coming from other places just than like pitching prospects in AAA, because the O's were having bullpen struggles. They were suffering from bullpen injuries. They were trying to find a way this year to put together a strong 8-man bullpen at all times. And these three players we're going to talk about today all at least played a part in the Orioles bullpen holding it together at points this season. So let's start with Matt Bowman. Matt Bowman, 33-year-old right-hander who the Orioles brought in late in the season in August after he had pitched with three other teams throughout the year: the Twins, the Diamondbacks, and the Mariners. He had appeared in at least one game for all three of those teams, had bounced around a bunch throughout the year, and then joined the Orioles on a minor league deal in mid-August. And the O's pretty quickly got him to the big leagues, calling him up to the big league roster on August 22nd. Let's start with what went right for Matt Bowman. Well, what went right is he kind of became a lesser version of a Jacob Webb for the Orioles when they were without Webb. Webb was on the injured list from August 4th through September 15th, missing over a month with an elbow issue. And Jacob Webb isn't, the top high leverage guy in the Orioles bullpen, but Webb, a very, very important middle reliever for this Orioles team, gets righties and lefties out, can pitch multiple innings. And we saw in that month plus, the Orioles were without him late in the year. That bullpen really struggled because he was like that bridge guy that, your starter gives you 5 1/3. You need to get the ball to the 7th. Jacob Webb could do that and do that successfully a lot of the time. And they missed him. And I'm not sure Matt Bowman fully filled in for what Webb did, but he gave them what he was able to, and he gave them some good pitching. It was 15 appearances for Bowman, 15 2/3 innings in an Oriole uniform. He had a 3.45 ERA in that stretch. In the 15 2/3, he allowed 15 hits, 6 runs, struck out 14, and walked 6 with 2 home runs allowed in that stretch. But during the time when Webb was out, this is when Bowman got called up on August 22nd until September 15th, when Webb came back from the injured list, Bowman was really, really good, and that was super helpful to have another reliable right-hander in the bullpen with Webb out. And again, Bowman still didn't assume the full role that Jacob Webb had, but he made Brandon Hyde's life a little bit easier to be able to fill in for him and know that, hey, Bowman ended up with, 3 or 4 high leverage scenarios as well, because he got into that circle of trust at one point for Brandon Hyde. In that stretch until September 15th, when Webb was out, Matt Bowman allowed just 1 run over 10 1/3 innings, 5 hits, 9 strikeouts, and 6 walks in that stretch. And his total leverage index by FanGraphs, which basically shows you how high leverage on average was the spots he was coming into, it wasn't to a Jacob Webb level. But after a couple of low leverage appearances when Bowman first came up, he was pretty close until Webb returned to that bullpen. And really, you look at his overall stats. I mentioned the 6 earned runs allowed in 15 2/3 innings. 4 of those 6 runs came in 1 appearance. And when you're a reliever and you haven't been with a team all year and you have 1 bad outing like Bowman did, he gave up 4 runs over 1/3 of an inning against the Yankees in one of his last outings of the year. That's going to completely ruin your ERA. You take out that outing and it's 15 1/3 innings pitched, 2 runs allowed. That's pretty good. Now you add that one back in and it looks like he had an okay stretch with the Orioles. And relievers are generally not going to be amazing every single night. But the other thing he did, and this is one of the reasons why he maybe wasn't Jacob Webb, he wasn't dominant against lefties, but Bowman certainly got righties out. Right-handed batters hit just 135 against Matt Bowman when he was in an Orioles uniform. And it was really that sinker-sweeper combination. Those were his top 2 pitches, and those are the 2 pitches that are the most effective for him against right-handed hitters. And that kind of makes it a perfect combination for Matt Bowman, to tell you the truth. When he can come in there, the pitches he commands the best, the pitches that feel the best in his hand. I mean, that sinker, he'd come in there and just get ground ball after ground ball. The sweeper, he was looking for swing and miss, and that stuff really, really played against the righties. Now, what went wrong for Matt Bowman, that is, he was getting the righties out. He was not getting the lefties out. And that is why he did not rise fully to the Jacob Webb level when he was replacing him in the Oriole bullpen. While righties hit 135 against Bowman, lefties hit 435 against Matt Bowman with the Orioles. This was a big-time platoon splits kind of guy. Now, over Bowman's entire career, which stretches back to, he debuted in the big leagues in 2016 with the Cardinals, so he's pitched in 211 major league games. He's definitely been better against righties his whole career, but it hasn't been a gigantic split. But since Bowman, had a couple of injuries and then got back to the big leagues in 2023 with the Yankees and kind of had overhauled his pitch mix, had changed his release, he became much more of a splits guy. His stuff just played much better against right-handers, and he's had bigger splits. And he has a cutter and a splitter, which are kind of his pitches he'll use against lefties, whereas that sinker sweeper is versus the righties. But the cutter splitter combo was just terrible in an Oriole uniform. Lefties were 6 for 7 against Bowman's cutter with the O's. Now, all 6 hits were singles, so he wasn't getting just, hit around the ballpark and hit into the seats. But 6 for 7 is not very good against that cut fastball. Lefties were also 4 for 7 against his splitter with an average exit velocity of 95.3 miles per hour against that pitch. Again, very small sample size, but still, he just had nothing against lefties. So the Orioles actually had him try and bring back a 4-seam fastball to attack those left-handers. It was kind of the only way that they felt, okay, can Matt Bowman figure something out here? Like, you look at his stuff, it's like, yeah, nobody hit the sinker, nobody hit the sweeper, everybody hit the cutter and the splitter. And a 4-seamer was something that he had mixed in the past. You go all the way back to 2019 with Cincinnati. And then before that with St. Louis, the 4-seamer for a while there was one of his most used pitches. And he had kind of gone away from it with the new arm angle. The sinker played better. The sinker moved more. But again, and let me tell you this, like, it wasn't like he took the 4-seamer with the Orioles and said, this is my pitch now. It wasn't exactly that. With Baltimore, he threw, he threw hundreds of pitches basically with the Orioles. He threw 2 total 4-seamers. So I'm not saying he completely put it back into his arsenal, but when you're a righty with a sinker that struggles against lefties, a 4-seam fastball up in the zone can help you get lefties out. And again, he only threw it twice, but that was something that the Orioles had him do. He did not do it this season with those three other teams. And that is something the Orioles did with Yennier Cano when he really started struggling against lefties this year. Kind of a sidearm style delivery with a good sinker, just like Bowman has. And they had Cano add a four-seam fastball, and it really helped him get lefties out when he would throw it high in the zone. And maybe that can happen for Bowman as well. But really the final thing that went wrong for him, he was left off the playoff roster. Even though when Bowman came up on August 22nd, he was on the active roster in the bullpen from there until the end of the regular season. Now, he was never like a top three reliever in that pen, but he was in that bullpen for over a month to finish the year. And despite that, Andy was healthy. He didn't make the playoff roster. Colin Selby got the postseason wildcard roster spot over Matt Bowman in that bullpen, and it was kind of a tough way for him to end his season. Now, what's the biggest storyline for Matt Bowman heading into next year and heading into the offseason? Well, he's got to figure out a mix that can at least get lefties out at a solid rate. He doesn't have to be dominant against lefties, especially if he's going to be dominant against righties. He's just got to be able to get some left-handers out to stick in the big league. So I don't think it'll be changing a lot about his pitch mix. Like, I think the cutter is a solid pitch. I think the splitter is a solid pitch. Maybe adding more and more of that four-seamer could be the key that unlocks it for Matt Bowman. But the other question just will be like, will he be able to survive the Orioles 40-man roster crunch? He is currently on the 40-man, but if you project out an 8-man bullpen, Matt Bowman is not part of it for the 2025 opening day bullpen for the O's. He would have some work to do. And he's also out of options, which makes him tougher to kind of move through the system. He would have to either make the opening day roster or be DFA'd. Now, he is arbitration eligible this offseason. MLB Trade Rumors estimates he'll make $1.3 million in 2025 in arbitration. So, I mean, for a reliever who you think could even help you in any way, $1.3 million is nothing. So I don't think that would make him, at least initially, a non-tender candidate. I think at the very least they'd, pay him the $1 million, at least bring him to spring training and let him compete for a roster spot. But he's going to have to find a way to get lefties out if he wants to win a roster spot. That is what is going to be tough for Matt Bowman. We will see. I would venture to say he's not on the Orioles long-term into next year. But again, I do think they'll tender him that $1 million, bring him to spring training, and then just kind of say, hey, we've got a spot or two open in that bullpen. Go fight for it and see what he can do, because the stuff is certainly interesting. And listen, he's been around the block. He's a veteran. He's 33. I'd give him a chance there in that pen. But again, Bowman was not the only veteran righty in his mid-30s, so the Orioles brought in to help this bullpen this year. The next one was Burch Smith, who actually spent a lot more time in the bullpen than Bowman, but had a few more struggles as well. We'll break down Burch Smith's time with the Orioles coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app, they actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. So with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. Now, unfortunately, you're not buying Orioles tickets right now, and not really buying baseball tickets at this point right now, but still plenty of sports action going on. Now, when we get back to spring training and opening day, Game Time is going to be your place to maybe even get those Orioles opening day tickets. But for now, Ravens tickets, Capitals tickets, Wizards tickets, maybe some Maryland basketball thrown in there, some Maryland football. It's all on Game Time. And their Game Time picks gives you curation that makes it easier to save more on sports, but not just sports. Hey, maybe your baseball is just your sport. I get it. It's the off season. Comedy, theater, concerts. Yeah, you can get those tickets too over at Game Time. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets and more with Game Time picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So we move on to talking about Burch Smith, who was also a veteran right-hander who came in and helped the Orioles this season. Burch Smith, 34-year-old righty, actually will turn 35 next April. So next year will basically be his age 35 season, who has certainly been around the block throughout his big league career. He pitched for the Padres and the Royals and the Oakland Athletics and the Milwaukee Brewers and the Giants. He went to the KBO. He came back over here. He pitched for the Marlins in 2024. The Marlins released him with a 4.25 ERA in 30 innings, and the Orioles scooped him up pretty immediately in July. They added him to the roster on July 11th, and he started to pitch really well. Let's start with what went right for Burch Smith. He got off to a really hot start for the O's. It was kind of an interesting roster move. When the Orioles added Burch Smith, it was for that Yankee series right before the All-Star break. They actually optioned Dylan Tate down to AAA to clear that spot. And that was a little bit shocking at that point. Not as shocking now because Tate was since DFA'd and is now a Toronto Blue Jay. But at that point, it was like, you're bringing up this guy, Burch Smith, who was bad for the Marlins, to replace Dylan Tate. Not like Tate was having the most amazing season, but it was a little confusing. And then Burch Smith went on a roll. In his first 9 appearances, he was pretty dominant. 10 innings of 2-run ball, 6 hits, 12 strikeouts to just 2 walks. And nearing the end of that span of 9 appearances, Brandon Hyde was starting to throw Smith out there in some high leverage spots. Like, again, at this point, you're looking at a team that is on the verge of losing Jacob Webb and your bullpen struggling a little bit. Like, Burch Smith was becoming, this is odd to say, but like, was he the number 2 righty behind Yennier Cano at one point in this bullpen, at least for like a week or so? He may have been, just because the Orioles were looking for answers anywhere for Burch Smith, and he came in and the Orioles adjusted the pitch mix a little bit. He immediately added a sweeper. It was something he had toyed with a little bit in the past, but the O's put it right into his repertoire. They had him throw his cutter way more, and opponents ended up hitting just 100 against his cutter with the Orioles in July. They also, whether it was adrenaline or something they found, were able to get his fastball velocity way up. He was basically throwing 94 with the Marlins. He came in throwing 96 on his 4-seamer with the Orioles. That certainly helped. And everything was kind of looking up. And the other thing was, he was similar to Zach Eflin, basically allergic to walking hitters. He did not walk a batter in his first 7 appearances with the Orioles. And even as he struggled, like down the stretch with the O's, he still posted in 26 2/3 innings a 2.8% walk rate. If you look at all pitchers in baseball from July 12th, which was the first time that the first time that Smith threw a pitch for the Orioles, until the end of the season, if you look all MLB pitchers in that time that threw at least 20 innings, Burch Smith's 2.8% walk rate was the 8th lowest among big league pitchers in that category. And among those 8 pitchers in the top 8 who basically weren't walking anybody, some of those guys don't strike out people either. They're just guys who throw strikes, get the ball put in play, don't have a whole lot of success. The only guy with a higher strikeout rate than Smith in that group was Griffin Jax, who was the setup man for the Minnesota Twins. Everybody else was kind of low strikeouts too, but Smith found a way to still strike out batters and then walk less than 3% of them at a completely elite rate. And that was really cool to see for Burch Smith. Unfortunately, although he continued throughout the rest of the year in August and September not walking batters, he started to allow hits and he started to allow home runs in that span. And that is what went wrong. Things kind of fell apart later in the season because although Smith was so good in July and those first few outings in August, he ended up with 25 appearances for the Orioles, 26 2/3 innings, and a 5.74 ERA in that stretch with the O's. He allowed 17 earned runs on 25 hits. The 23 Ks and just 3 walks was awesome, but he allowed 5 home runs as an Oriole, and all 5 of those homers came in the month of August. He threw 13 innings for the O's in August, had a 6.92 ERA with 5 long balls allowed. It felt like, no, this wasn't the case, again, 13 innings, but it felt like every time he went out there, Smith was allowing a big-time home run. And it became tough because we almost got to the point where it was like, yeah, he was allowing some other hits, but there wasn't much else happening against him except for the homers. It was just like he'd give up an ill-timed single and then boom, a 2-run homer. And remember, at this point, Smith was pitching in some high-leverage spots, and it would just completely change the game. And then we got to September, and he got even worse. Now, he only threw 5 1/3 innings in September, but he had an 8.44 ERA there. And at that point, he had become the mop-up guy. Like, he was no longer in leverage when we got to September, and it looked like his days were numbered. And one of the issues was, like, even though he wasn't walking guys, again, still, he walked 3 batters in like 26 innings and change with the Orioles. That is elite, quote unquote, command. But sometimes you can not walk guys and still not have pinpoint command. You're just missing in the middle of the zone and getting hit hard. And that is what happened to Burch Smith. That cutter that was so good, the Orioles had him throw it more. Opponents hit 100 against it in July. He lost the feel for that cutter. Initially, he was dotting it on the inside and outside corner. He could throw it wherever he wanted. Then in August and September, that completely stopped. In August, 286 batting average and a 93 mile per hour average exit velocity against that cutter. And then opponents hit 667 against it in September when he re-dropped the usage of it because he couldn't throw it where he wanted to. And he went away from that pitch, and it was his best pitch. So without his best pitch, he just became more and more hittable as the season went on, and he struggled even more. And the Orioles, eventually his season ended because on September 20th, he was placed on the injured list with a right adductor groin strain and did not return for the regular season and did not return for the postseason either for the Orioles. And it's funny to think about because at the point when Smith was placed on the IL, which effectively ended his season at that point, he seemed to be the guy who was going to be on the roster bubble anyway. Jacob Webb and Danny Coulomb were coming back to rejoin the Orioles, and they had some hitters who were coming back too. And you were looking around and you were like, yes, Smith was good at one point, but he's pitching so poorly right now. He seemed to be the guy that was going to lose his roster spot. So initially when he was placed on the IL, I thought, oh, this might be a phantom IL. They don't want to lose him. They don't want to DFA him. They're just going to put him on the injury list. But then it more so seemed like a real injury when he went on that IL. And although the stuff and the velocity were mostly there, even when he was struggling, the command was not. And that kind of groin injury could be affecting, you're pushing off of that right leg, and maybe you're not getting down the mound as much. It's screwing up your entire mechanics, and you're not getting the command. That could have been the case, and that could have been why he couldn't command the cutter anymore, and he just started getting hit later into the season. And so that is really kind of the big question and the big storyline for Burch Smith heading into the offseason. Like, were the late season issues because of the injury, or did the injury more so pop up and it ended up being a good excuse to put him on the IL and not have him on the roster? That's something at this point we do not know the answer to. But as Smith goes through this offseason, we will learn more about. Now, I will say, and I'm asking for your help in the comments right here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. But please jump in the comments if you are a little more clear, and I try to be the one who knows the most about this roster stuff, but sometimes it's hard to find out what Burch Smith's roster status is going into this offseason. So sometimes when guys go to, Korea like Smith did and then come back while they're still in their arbitration years, when they do it before they've hit free agency, it can kind of mess up their ARB years a little bit. Like, surprisingly, Albert Suarez, as old as he is, like, the Orioles still have like 2 or 3 more years of team control on him because he went to Asia for so long that when he came back, he just picked up on his MLB service time. Now, Burch Smith has spent a little bit more time in the big leagues at this point. He has like 4 to 5 years of service time. So that would tell me, okay, he would still be arbitration eligible. But MLB Trade Rumors does not have him on their arbitration estimate list for this offseason. And if you go to FanGraphs, they are identifying him as a upcoming free agent this offseason. Now, I have not operated off the assumption that he is a free agent. I've been operating off the assumption that he at least is under contract for 1 more year. And that's what I'm leaning towards, what it seems to be, but I do not know the right answer. So we got to answer that as well. Now, if he's just a free agent, there's not as many questions. The O's will probably let him hit free agency, maybe offer him a minor league deal, whatever. But if he's not a free agent, the big question becomes the same as it was for Matt Bowman. Can he stick around and hold on to his 40-man roster spot? And just like Bowman, he will be out of options. So it gives him a little less roster flexibility. And so if the O's really do think, hey, he was injured, they liked him enough, and maybe they'll keep him around. If they think, it wasn't really the injury that was hurting him, he's probably a fairly easy DFA candidate. I'm 50-50 on whether or not we see Burch Smith in spring training with the Orioles next year. That'll be kind of intriguing to watch this offseason. But there is one final guy to talk about that the O's added to this bullpen late in the year. And pound for pound, he was the best of the 3. That was the mystery that is Colin Selby. We'll talk about him to finish off the pod coming up next. So we finish things up chatting about Colin Selby and reviewing his 2024 season with the Orioles, which really was not a lot of time with the O's in 2024, at least at the big league level. Now, Colin Selby came over on like a waiver claim, trade for cash from the Royals in mid-July, and he went to AAA, and the Orioles kind of revamped his pitch mix. He had a 4.24 ERA in 17 innings with AAA Norfolk, but he was posting the best strikeout rates of his career. In Norfolk, 36% strikeout rate. That is an absurdly high and elite number for the 27, well, actually, he was 26 at this point. Selby, who just turned 27 the other day. Happy birthday to him. But for the right-hander with the amazing beard. He came in, and then the Orioles had about a month of cooking him in AAA, and that was kind of the first thing that went right for Colin Selby in 2024. The Orioles really modified his stuff and made him better. Now, he had bounced around a little bit in the big leagues before. He had pitched 2 games with the Royals earlier this year. He had pitched in 21 games with the Pirates in 2023, which is where he made his major league debut, but it never really caught on and had big time success with anyone. But then he started having it at the AAA level with the Orioles because they just were, for somehow, they probably worked with the pitching coaches down there, working with Justin Ramsey, adjusting the grip on his pitches. They got his slider and his sinker to move way more and add velocity. He was up to 97 with that sinker and 89 on the slider. It was nasty, nasty stuff that he was throwing down there in AAA to go along with the 4-seam fastball and with the curveball that he throws as well. It was filthy. And all that stuff, they had him throw more of those sinkers and sliders. He was still throwing the 4-seamer and the curveball. They just had him bump down that usage less because they felt the slider and the sinker were his 2 best pitches. And you could, when you watched him, you certainly saw that as well because of how much those things moved and what good velocity they had. So he came up, the Orioles called him up on August 16th after about a month with them in AAA. And that was what else went right. Like his 3 big league appearances with the Orioles. Again, he had only 3 big league appearances with the Orioles, but they went swimmingly. 4 scoreless innings in those 3 appearances, 1 hit, 2 walks, 1 hit batter, and 5 strikeouts in that time. He came up in August and he pitched twice in that series at Citi Field when the Orioles lost 2 of 3 against the Mets. They had those 2 heartbreaking walk-off losses in that series, but he pitched in games 1 and 3. He went an inning and a third scoreless in game 1, and then an inning and 2/3 scoreless in game 3. And this is at a point where, we're in late August. The Orioles bullpen is not figuring out. They don't have Danny Coulomb. They just lost Jacob Webb. Some of the guys were struggling down the stretch. Gregory Soto still couldn't figure it out yet. All these questions in this Oriole bullpen. And they call up this guy, Colin Selby, and he throws 3 scoreless innings looking absolutely filthy against a really good Mets lineup in those 2 games in August. And you're just like, I don't know if Colin Selby is going to become the 8th inning guy, but you're like, we might have a solid middle reliever who can really help this team down the stretch. Remember, at this point, like Burch Smith was also starting to struggle. And you kind of didn't know what you had out of some of these guys. And Colin Selby looked like a savior. And then he got sent down, and we'll talk about that. But he came back up on the final day of the season, threw a scoreless inning in the 9th to close out the Orioles' sweep of the Twins. He actually threw the final pitch of the regular season for the 2024 Baltimore Orioles. There's a piece of trivia for you right there. The answer is Colin Selby. And listen, it was only 3 appearances and some good stuff in AAA, but it was enough to get him on the postseason roster, despite pitching in just 3 games for this O's team. As I mentioned when talking about Matt Bowman, they called up Selby for that final day of the regular season. He pitched a scoreless inning, and he made the playoff roster in the wild card round against the Royals over Matt Bowman. They left Bowman off the roster and gave that spot to Colin Selby. And really, it was just because stuff plays in the postseason, and Selby's stuff was just so nasty that they decided, you know what? Let's go with Colin Selby. And honestly, I didn't hate it. Like, his stuff was really, really good. The stuff plus from Fangraphs on his pitches with the Orioles, absurd. Listen to this. The stuff plus on his sinker, remember, for most of these, about 100 is right around league average. On his sinker with the Royals, 91. On his sinker with the Orioles, 131. His 4-seam fastball up to 102 with the Orioles. His slider, 91 with the Royals, 149 stuff plus with the Orioles, and 144 on the curveball. That gave him a total 135 stuff plus as a pitcher with the O's. Basically meant he had some of the best pure raw stuff on this Orioles pitching staff this year, and he only pitched in 3 big league games. And that is what went wrong for Colin Selby this year. The Orioles, after those two great appearances against the Mets, sent him back down to AAA on August 22nd. And we all kind of wondered, what? Like, that was dominant. The Orioles need him. What are they doing? Well, he kind of got the short end of the stick of a weird roster situation. On August 22nd, there were like 6 different moves that the Orioles made to shuffle players between the IL and AAA and Baltimore, and Selby got caught up in it. And basically what happened was the Orioles had to call Matt Bowman up. They had signed him to a minor league deal a week earlier, and that minor league contract with Matt Bowman had a stipulation in it that basically if he wasn't called up in the next week, he would have the ability to choose free agency again. And the Orioles, they wanted Matt Bowman. They wanted him to stick around, and they wanted him to be a possibility for the playoff roster. So they gave Matt Bowman that spot. And unfortunately, again, because Selby had minor league options, and as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the relievers in the Orioles bullpen this year didn't, it kind of tied up their hands behind their back, and they were forced to have Selby be the one that they sent down to AAA. Like, it was unfortunate. But they got to a point where their other options were like Yennier Cano or Keegan Aiken. And those were two guys who they just were too big a part of the bullpen. They were not going to send them down. So Selby became the answer, and it was unfortunate. Now, that wasn't super weird. You kind of understood it. But the weird part was that he didn't come back up again until the final day of the regular season. It took the Orioles over a month to recall him. Now, he wasn't as dominant when he went back to AAA, but you knew the stuff was good. And it was so weird that they never called him back up, even though the bullpen was having issues. And then when they did call him back up, they chose him as one of the relievers to be on the playoff roster. So it was like, if you're going to put him on the playoff roster, why did he spend so much time in AAA? Like, yes, because of the rules, he had to spend 15 days back down in AAA. So you add 15 days to August 22nd, you're looking at like, what, September 7th, 8th? He was eligible to come back to the big leagues. And it took the Orioles 3 more weeks to call him back up. It was very odd. But hey, he is still on this team. And now we talk about the biggest storyline for him heading into the offseason. Like, can he survive the 40-man crunch? It's the same question for him as it was for Burch Smith and for Matt Bowman. But here's the thing. I believe this is correct. Colin Selby still has another year of minor league options in 2025, which is huge because he's not arbitration eligible. He'll still be making close to the minimum. If you can keep him on the 40-man roster, which I think the Orioles should do because that stuff is nasty, even if there's not quite a spot for him in the opening day bullpen, you can just option him to AAA Norfolk and not lose him. And then as soon as you need him next year, you can call him up and let him loose with that incredible stuff from the right side. So I really do think he's going to be back with the O's next year, fighting for a spot on that opening day bullpen in Sarasota. So I wanted to finish things off by just kind of grouping all 3 of these guys together: Matt Bowman, Burch Smith, and Colin Selby. All 3 righties who joined the Orioles late in the year to kind of plug up holes. You know, only one of them ended up on the playoff roster, but they all played a part for this Orioles team. And there's a chance, potentially a small chance, but a chance they could all be back with the Orioles in 2025. The issue is there's not really space for a lot of them. Now, remember, some of these guys may not be back. More likely, some of these guys will get injured. We know Jacob Webb had injury issues this year. Danny Coulomb had injury issues this year. Yennier Cano had injury issues this year. Felix Bautista coming off Tommy John. Like, these guys all have questions. But if you were to project the Orioles opening day 8-man bullpen right now for 2025, I would say Felix Bautista, Yennier Cano, Gregory Soto, Seranthony Dominguez, Cionel Perez, Danny Coulomb, Keegan Aiken, and Jacob Webb. Those are your 8 relievers. That doesn't include Selby, Smith, or Bowman. So they're kind of behind the 8 ball already. Now, again, some of those guys could get injured to open up spots, but it would be really tough for all 3 of them to end up on the roster. If I had to rank them in terms of most likely to stay with the Orioles in 2025, I'd say very high up is Colin Selby, number 1. He's got the best stuff and he's got options. Then I'd say number 2 is actually Burch Smith. Although Bowman was better than Smith, I think the injury contributed to Smith losing his command. And the fact that the Orioles trusted Smith for so long makes me think that they see a lot in him. And Bowman's number 3 just because he's bounced around so much. He's out of options. I think he'll just get caught up in the roster crunch this offseason. But I'll tell you right now, if any of these guys, those 8 players I just mentioned, slip up for whatever reason, get traded away, get injured, whatever it may be, look at Colin Selby to maybe be the first guy to jump up and get an opening day bullpen spot next year. Maybe I'll call my shot right now. Colin Selby is on the Orioles opening day roster. That's how much I believe in the stuff. I believe in what he's got. The Orioles better hold on to him this offseason. For Burch Smith and Matt Bowman, we will certainly see. But that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening, for watching, wherever that may be. Thank you for your support of the podcast. We will be back with one more episode this week. That's coming up tomorrow. We will talk about a little more Orioles news and notes. We'll break down all the goings-on of the 2024 World Series. We'll maybe look a little further into what offseason stuff will begin next week as the offseason kind of officially commences 5 days after the World Series ends. And then any other Orioles news and notes that may come in, we'll get to on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.